All right, time to make some final conclusions about FM synthesis, frequency modulation. And as I said at the beginning of this week, the theory is quite simple, but the practical application can be somewhat difficult and it's challenging in a lot of ways. And I think the biggest way is in the sound that's produced itself. And we're going to talk a little bit about production strategies and techniques that you may consider employing just based on historical context. So at the start of this week, we went in and we used a bunch of VA subtractive based synthesizers and used the FM option within the instrument. And not a lot of people tend to do that. And I think that has to do with a misconception about FM and how it's used and how difficult it is to set up. But when you just have a couple of oscillators, you can really use FM as a special effect, combine it with your filters, combine it with your envelopes, the other stuff in the instrument. And it can give you some really interesting timbres, things that you just can't generate any other way. And in the digital world that we live with these software synthesizers, we don't have to worry about things going out of tune. So it's going to be controllable FM for the most part. And so definitely something to take advantage of. And then for the rest of the week, we really looked at FM as a method. So no filter, just operators, and then employing frequency modulation to generate sidebands based on ratios and then depth that was being set. So those were the two things that we really looked about and talked about with FM. And when you're using FM as a method, it's really all about the algorithms. So what is the relationship between carrier and modulator? And I didn't talk too much about that, mainly because nowadays you can use more of a hybrid approach and you're not just maybe going to be using sine waves. But when you are just using sine waves like the classic DX7, the algorithm is what makes the biggest impact on that sound. And so knowing what to use, or even just for experimental purposes, picking an algorithm can be really important to the final timbre that's generated. And last but not least, and this is something that we didn't spend too much time talking about, digital technology, digital sound. FM is a digital technology. And so in the computer, it can be really precise, right? It's the software, and then it's just outputting directly to us, usually through a very clean playback system, headphones, monitors, whatever. And you have to compare that to the DX7 in its heyday, which was the mid 80s towards the end of the 80s. And at that time, everything was still all analog in terms of how the sound was being captured, how it was being recorded. So you'd have your DX7, you'd run the output of that, which I believe was still like analog circuitry, right? So you're running the output of your DX7 into some kind of preamplifier, then into a mixing console. Eventually it's going to be recorded onto tape, and then from tape, maybe it's being cut to vinyl. And there's a lot of stages there where color is being added, where oomph is being added, that sort of like color and character stuff that we've talked about before. In the computer, none of that is factored in. So you are just hearing those overtones and those partials as is in a very pure state. And so people will describe that as being very digital sounding, very cold, very harsh. I like to use the word precise. And that is difficult to drop into a mix, especially a mix where you have like other analog type stuff going on, or like virtual analog type stuff going on. So this is one case where I will give you a little bit of a production advice. If you're using something like Dext, or you're using the FM8 and you're not going in and applying effects from the instrument, it will make a lot of sense to run your DX7 into some kind of console emulation, into maybe like a tape emulation, possibly use like an analog chorus, throw in maybe a little bit of distortion or saturation, and that will at least bring the sound out so that it's not so cold and so harsh, and will hopefully blend in with everything else. It will also sound a little bit more realistic to the 80s if that's what you're going for. All right, so something we'll spend a lot more time talking about in the sound design course, but it's worth bringing up now. I know that when I bring up the FM8 and I load up a preset and there's no effects being added from the instrument, which again, I encourage you to do some of that, especially with FM and especially with like FM8. it just doesn't seem like it would ever work. It's just so cold, it's so precise, it's so digital that something needs to be added to give it a little more oomph and a little more character. And you think back to the FM4, this might be another reason why it's not using pure sine waves, and instead you kind of have the beginnings of a triangle wave, making sure that you can get a few more overtones, a few more partials to richen up and liven up the sound. One exception would be if you're looking for a super clean sub bass, right? That's a time when you want to have really precise controls over those harmonics that are being generated. You don't want anything extra to possibly muddy up the mix or, take away space from other important instruments. Looking ahead, there's not a whole lot to look ahead to. We're going to have a course wrap-up video where we're going to talk about some of the overarching themes of this course, what's next after you've learned all this information, how do you apply it, and so forth. So thank you very much for getting through this week, and I'm assuming you made it through all the other sections. And I really can't wait to hear how you're able to apply all of this information to your own music. So the foundation has been laid. Now it's time for you to put that house on top of it.